A comparison I've always found interesting between 40k and the two fantasy settings of Warhammer is the treatment the elves get in the setting. On the one hand, we have the elves of the fantasy games. The Dark Elves are the terror of the seas, the Wood Elves are treated with fear by damn near everyone who has to interact with them, and the High Elves have saved the world more times than there are humans in the setting. And that's not even mentioning Age of Sigmar, where the Lumineth looked at Nagash about to drown all of the setting in death magic and just went, nuh-uh. And then we have 40k, where the Eldar have two kinds of stories for themselves. Them losing horribly, and them only winning because a human was helping them out in some way. Like the Inari, who lost so hard that their trilogy was cancelled, meaning they failed so completely that real life was affected. And nothing in this setting embodies this more than the treatment of Khaine, the bloody-handed god of these two settings' elven factions. On the one hand, you have a rightfully feared god of war, and on the other, you have a god who's only not called a clown because the Eldar already have one of those. So let me tell you about the angriest knife ear in existence, and if you're mostly just a fan of 40k, make sure to listen closely to the fantasy section. Maybe I can convince you that this mad lad deserves some more respect than zero. But hold the phone, Gadies and Lentilmen. I'm about to start talking about a god of war from Warhammer. You know what else starts with war and has 3 syllables in the name? WarThunder, the sponsor of today's video. What a fantastic segue, so why don't I follow it up by telling you about a fantastic game? What is WarThunder? WarThunder is the world's most comprehensive vehicle combat game, full stop. How comprehensive? 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and naval vessels comprehensive, all of which are fully rendered down to their individual components. Now, that's more comprehensive than I am as a reader, and I read really goodly. Did I mention it's also free to play on Xbox, PlayStation, and PC? Because it is. Free is the best price, so you have no excuses not to give it a try. The fact it's 2,000 tanks, aerial vehicles, and warships is something that particularly gets me going, because all those things on their own are cool as hell. And you, the viewer, agree with me, because you're a Warhammer fan watching a Warhammer video. You like when things go boom. And in WarThunder, all those different types of warfare can all go boom together. Take potshots at a Navy ship from your tank, kamikaze your plane into an enemy tank formation because it's funny. All of this and more is possible. And of course, all of these vehicles are incredibly customizable. Painted in hundreds of shades of camouflage, or put historical markings all over it and wave the flag of your choice with pride. Hell, put a goddamn bush on the front of your tank and go AFK waiting for some fool to wander in front of you. And most importantly of all, you can control aircraft with the mouse aim mode. You can play WarThunder without a $10,000 flight simulator setup that looks like it came from the Matrix, and for that I salute this game with all my heart. Play WarThunder now for free on Xbox, PC, and PlayStation. I am not asking. You will use my link in the description or pinned comment, you will get a whole ton of currency, premium vehicles, a premium account, and more for free, and you will play WarThunder today. Alright, let's talk about the K-Man himself. Khaine is the Warhammer's Elfdar god of war and murder, and right out of the gate, I'm telling you that he's a badass. Some people might be rolling their eyes and going, everyone defends Khaine nowadays, you aren't special for doing that. And that's a fair statement, because Warhammer fans love nothing more than overplayed memes and beating dead horses. But Khaine, after getting his new model, didn't get better, so I don't feel bad for making a point of saying it. He continues to at best either get a draw or die anyways, but this time he killed 6 whole Space Marines and a Dreadnought on the way out, which is better than what he normally gets. So to reiterate, Khaine, the bloody-handed god Khaine, is a badass. As I'll do with all crossover characters such as Gork and Mork, I will once again start with his 40k iteration. Khaine gets his start with all the other Eldar gods back in the War in Heaven, being used as giant weaponized warp beings by the Eldar to fight the Catan after the old ones gave everyone involved a power boost. Now, as with all things War in Heaven, I'm gonna give you some conjecture. There's a few theories on the Eldar gods' origins. Maybe they were already gods, and when the Eldar got boosted by the old ones, their gods naturally did so too. Maybe they were weapons that got naturally turned into gods over time as a result of the Eldar worshipping them. And maybe, just maybe, some or all of the Eldar gods are old ones themselves who changed themselves to become the gods of their favored weapon race. Personally, I think it's the first one. I prefer the idea that the Eldar were able to at the very least have their own set of gods rather than have that just been thrown at them by the psychic space frogs. But from what I could tell from reading recent Eldar codices, I'm pretty sure modern day 40k lore is leading towards them being weapons that turned into gods. And I'll also admit that I prefer the interpretation I do because it sounds more like Warhammer fantasy. Nevertheless, the purpose of the Eldar gods was much clearer: fight toe-to-toe with the Catan at the height of their power. And Khaine certainly wasn't one to shy away from that job. The king of the gods Assyrian was probably the strongest one. He's the king of the gods after all, and in mythology, the king is usually also the biggest ass kicker, though not always, I'll admit. But Khaine was pretty firmly number 2, and so you understand that I'm not BSing you, Khaine shattered the Nightbringer. A full-powered Catan who gave the galaxy the concept of the Grim Reaper because he was so deadly, and Khaine just walked up and beat the hell out of him. He destroyed the Nightbringer's physical form through his scythe, which incidentally had a great deal of the Catan's power embedded into it, so deep into the warp not even the other Eldar gods could ever reach it, and then walked away looking for more big things to smash. Fun fact, Khaine might have actually been an honorable sort of warrior before this, with the Nightbringer's essence tainting him to turn him into the asshole you'll soon see he'll become. Also, hope you were listening close to that, Necron fans. The glory that is Khaine punked on one of the strongest of the Catan and walked away with the only lasting repercussion being that he was a little bit crankier from there on out. In fact, one interpretation is that Khaine sharding him is what put the fear of death in everyone else when all that Nightbringer juice leaked out of his exploding body. Feel free to tell me how the Necrons were still totally the winners of the War in Heaven in the comments, by the way, everyone. But while the main War in Heaven ended with a decisive Eldar victory, the Eldar gods not long after found out that it was now time for a literal War in Heaven. And none other than our boy Khaine was in the middle of it. The Eldar goddess of prophecy, Lilith, had a very interesting vision one day. She saw that the mortal Eldar would one day tear Khaine into millions of itty-bitty pieces. Lilith could have done any number of things about this. She could have gone to her parents, Isha and Kurnos, and maybe talked to them about having her mortal siblings not do that to Khaine. She could have done some stuff herself to ensure that it doesn't happen. Or at the very least, tell someone like Asuryan, who everyone respects and listens to. Instead, she marched right up to Khaine, who is a massive asshole, and informed him the Eldar are going to totally super kill him. Now again, Khaine could have done any number of things with this information. He could have gone to some of the other gods about removing the Nightbringer taint from him, because presumably if he was much less of an asshole, the mortal Eldar wouldn't have had a reason to kill him. He could have trained his own members of the Eldar Pantheon to serve as his agents in the mortal world. That way it would ensure that the entirety of the mortal Eldar could never turn against him. Or at the very absolute least, he could have done some push-ups and sit-ups for a few million years, so if the Eldar ever actually tried it, they'd get stomped into the dirt. Instead, he marched right down in the material world and starts butchering the Eldar. I imagine it must have really sucked to be the first Eldar unlucky enough to be in front of Khaine. Imagine you're an Eldar after the War in Heaven is wrapped up. You're just walking along, minding your own business, probably just enjoying the scenery because this would be well before the Eldar got all Slaaneshi. All of a sudden, reality rips asunder and one of your gods tears their way into it. The Eldar up to this point had pretty good relations with their gods. They fought alongside each other against the Necrons and the Catan, and they could still freely interact with each other at this point. Something like this arguably wasn't that rare of an occurrence. So any number of things could have been welling up inside your chest. Maybe you think it'll be a nice visit from Grandma and Grandpa because Isha and Kurnos are coming over for dinner. Maybe Lilith has come, and since she's technically your sister, she could be here for anything from a prophecy of things to come to asking if you want to get drinks that weekend. Or hell, maybe it's Asuryan himself, and you of all people have been chosen to receive wisdom that will usher in a new era for your people. Oh look, it's Khaine. Well, that's fine. He's a bit rude, but he's still a mighty god. Maybe you've been chosen to help him combat the next great threat to the Eldar. A great honor, to be sure. Then he slams down on top of you at Mach 5000 like the world's angriest ODST and starts going to town on all of your friends. He does this for an indeterminate amount of time before Isha gets upset. For whatever reason, Khaine murdering all of her children made her very unhappy. When Khaine told her to go crime a river, she went to Asuryan and did just that. Asuryan didn't want to deal with either Khaine killing all his worshippers or Isha's nonstop nagging over getting Khaine to stop, so he decided to just separate the warp and the materium. No more crossing over between realms unless you're either doing wizard stuff or dead and going to the afterlife. Khaine shrugged his shoulders and figured that was good enough. Isha did not, because for some reason Isha wasn't happy upon being told that she could never interact with her kids again unless they had literally died. God, what a drama queen, am I right? Or maybe, given who she's connected to in Warhammer Fantasy, drama Everqueen might be better. God, I'm funny. So Isha and Kurnos went to Vol, Eldar Hephaestus. He made them each some spirit stones to let them whisper to their mortal children across Asuryan's barrier. At one point they got a bit too cocky with doing this in secret, however, and Khaine caught them in the act. For once, he didn't just stab them on the spot, instead going to Asuryan and tattling on them like a little sibling when you're not giving them a turn on the Xbox. Asuryan didn't want to look biased in either side's favor, and since Isha and Kurnos had technically broken his rules, he told Khaine that he could do whatever he wanted to them as punishment. Khaine chose to torment them forever because he's a real class act like that. He didn't really care about Vol at first. Vol's just the dude who made the Spirit Stones, and by all accounts was a pretty chill dude. Then Vol made him a bet. If he can make 100 literally god-tier swords in a year, Khaine has to let them go. Not really having anything to lose, Khaine agreed, and probably went to go watch Top Gun for a year straight while Vol went to work. But poor Vol couldn't quite do it. In a year he made 99 swords, but the 100th was just a bit too much for him. So we figured, hey, Khaine's probably a complete idiot. he won't realize if one single sword isn't quite up to snuff. So Vol came up with a plan. What if he was to purchase a mortal sword and disguise it as his own craftsmanship? Ho ho ho, delightfully devilish, Vol. So that's just what he did. Chucked a regular sword in with the rest, grabbed Isha and Kurnos because Khaine figured Vol hadn't tricked him, and then ran as fast as he possibly could away from Khaine. Khaine, however, was not an idiot, and despite Vol's defense that the sword only looked normal because of a patent family recipe, Khaine knew a fake when he saw one. So suddenly, Khaine now wants Vol dead instead of Isha and Kurnos, and the other Elder Gods this time start picking sides. Some side with Khaine because every other party involved in this affair has in some way gone against how things were supposed to be. Others looked at how they had broken their word in order to be able to speak to their children and not get tortured for all eternity, and understandably thought Khaine was just being a massive ass. So every Elder God except for Assyrian starts going at it. Assyrian was just kinda sat on his throne, but knew if he picked a side, the other one would completely ignore him going forward. Perhaps not the best call to make, but I at least get where he's coming from. That way he could at least mitigate the worst of what one side was going to do, because he's still technically an impartial observer. Two things would end the war in heaven. One is Khaine imprisoning Vol. Vol did end up creating that 100 sword, better than the other 99 of them, and fought Khaine himself. Unfortunately for Vol, he was still just a craftsman, a godly one who had created weapons to shatter the Catan themselves, but still just a craftsman. Khaine, meanwhile, was a god of war and still had 99 pretty alright divine swords to choose from. It'd be like if I gave you the sharpest sword ever forged in human history and told you to win a fight against Mike Tyson, who has the second sharpest sword in human history. Vol lost the battle and was chained by Khaine to his forge to make weapons for him for all time. The other reason that caused the war in heaven to end is Khaine's battle against the Eldar hero Eldanesh. Now this guy was a real champ. He would fight Catan directly alongside the Eldar gods, and he was just overall the greatest and strongest champion of them to ever live. When Khaine started acting a fool, Eldanesh ended up fighting him for one of three reasons. One potential reason is that he also got his hand on the 100 sword and wanted to fight Khaine for Vol's freedom, because again, he's just a stand-up guy. The second possibility is that Khaine wanted Eldanesh to keep going on murder sprees after the Necrons were dealt with, but Eldanesh, being a cool dude, didn't want that. And the final potential reason is that as the closest thing the mortal Eldar had to a leader, it just ended up being Eldanesh's job to tell Khaine to stop being such a massive prick. The gods fighting all the time made things a bit rough for the mortal Eldar, and they'd rather they all calmed down. Now, like I said, Eldanesh was a cool dude and a great hero. I have no doubt in my mind he could have wiped the floor with any of the Primarchs. But Khaine is not a Primarch. Khaine is a god. So Eldanesh got crumped. Assyrian by this point had had enough with all this crap. Khaine had just imprisoned Vol, killed a mortal Eldar champion, and wasn't looking like he was going to stop anytime soon. He had also come to regret tossing Isha and Kurnos to Khaine's tender mercies just so he didn't have to listen to people bitch any longer. So he swooped down in, told everyone to calm the hell down because he was sick of it, and cursed Khaine to forever bleed from his hands as a reminder to all of the crimes he'd committed. This is indeed what gave him the title of Kala Mencha, the Bloody-Handed. Vol still has to make swords for him forever though. Poor Vol. Maybe Assyrian would visit him once a week with some drinks and snacks or something. I like to think he did. After that, millions of years go by. Khaine presumably does nothing but eat raw protein powder and watch Top Gun some more during this time. All the while, the Eldar start getting a bit wacky, a little bit more horny, a lot bit more degenerate. The warp's turning into a hurricane all of a sudden, the Eldar gods are losing power, things aren't looking too good for them. Khaine, for his part, didn't seem to care much, until he suddenly had a great deal many reasons to care, because Slaanesh was born, 99% of the Eldar died, and 99% of their gods had gone down with him. All that were left was himself, Kegarak, and Isha. Kegarak had wisely decided to cut his losses and hide in the webway, and Isha was presently sitting on the ground trying to process the fact that everyone she knew and loved had just gotten soul-vored. All that remained between Slaanesh and complete domination of the Eldar pantheon was Khaine. So Khaine went to work. The two went to blows with each other, but neither could ultimately claim victory. Slaanesh was glutted on the souls of nearly the entirety of everything that was Eldar, and was riding that high into temporarily being the strongest deity in the warp. Khaine, meanwhile, was a god of war from a conflict that raged when the dinosaurs were still a thing. It's been a while since I've looked into evolutionary history, but I don't think mammals were even primates yet before Khaine was shattering Catan for breakfast. So neither of them could kill each other. Then Khorne shows up to ruin everything, as he does. Khorne says that since Khaine is a god of war, he belongs to him. Slaanesh says that since Khaine is an Eldar deity, he belongs to her. They both channeled their power into him, and he explodes and was cast out into the material plane and landed across the Eldar craft worlds. When pieces of him showed up in a craft world, everyone went a little bit berserk for a bit and started killing each other, but then they cooled down. And at the end of all of this was Lolith's prophecy fulfilled. Though they didn't do it directly, the moral degradation of the Eldar had caused Khaine to be shattered and spread across all of reality. Now, not to toot my own horn, but I think I've done a solid job on showing that Khaine has a history of kicking ass. Unfortunately, that history is just about over now. As he stands now in 40k, he is a scattered collection of divine shards that reside at the heart of every craft world, an iron statue ready to be animated with the rage of a god. Whenever the Eldar have need of him, there's two ways they can go about waking him up so we can do Avatar of Khaine things. Option 1 is they can sacrifice an Exarch to Khaine to wake the lazy bastard up. The Exarch is referred to as the Young King, and no, I don't know if they change it if the Exarch is a lady or not. No one knows exactly what's involved in this ritual because the Eldar aren't sharing the information, but whatever the case, the end result is the Exarch is lost mind, body, and soul to Khaine. Maybe he becomes a part of Khaine's essence, maybe he just sits in a demiplane Khaine has when he's not animating a statue, maybe he's thrown into the warp and gets insta-vored by Slaanesh. The other way of awakening Khaine is if you get at least 6 of the Phoenix Lords together and have them put their weapons at the foot of the statue, it wakes him up. Since the Phoenix Lords are Eldar Primarchs, it not only gets the statue animated, but lets him go Super Saiyan, giving him one hell of a power boost. Of course, given that there's almost no chance one Phoenix Lord will be at any given battle, let alone 6 or more of the fuckers, this method generally isn't used. And if it is being used, you probably don't want to be at the battle where 6 of the most legendary beings in Eldar history are about to throw down. The Eldar only summon him in moments of dire need, not only because of the fact they lose an Exarch when he shows up, but because he also makes them a bit murder hobo-y. Being as psychic as the Eldar are, and combined with the fact they experience emotions at a heightened level, Khaine's influence turns even the most passive of Eldar into mini-Khaines, ready to beat the hell out of anyone who happens to exist in their general vicinity. This all still makes the Avatar of Khaine sound badass, so let me do some quick fixing of that. There are 2.5 pieces of Warhammer lore I could find that don't involve Khaine getting bodied. One of them is from the 90s, which is already a great sign for how GW treats him in 40k. It involves Khaine being summoned to deal with a Slaaneshi army, and the Keeper of Secrets leading it. He did so when his sheer presence drove the Eldar army into a frenzy, and it was actually pretty badass. He defeated the Keeper of Secrets handily, returned home to rest in the craft world like avatars do in the rare instances they aren't slaughtered, and the Eldar character you followed in the lore blur was just sitting there in complete shock. The other was released in 2018, and I'll talk about it a bit later, as I will the half instance where he wasn't bodied. Now we get to Khaine's long list of defeats. The big one a lot of people know about is Marneus Calgar beating him in hand-to-hand combat, which is depressing. I like Calgar, but that's a bit much. A Keeper of Secrets managed to possess one once, which is especially galling, not only given the relation Slaanesh has with the Eldar, but because Slaanesh explicitly couldn't kill Khaine just as much as he couldn't kill her. One time he tried to call out to a Hive Tyrant for an honorable duel, whereupon the Hive Tyrant just stampeded him with a dozen Carnifexes. I think he managed to kill half of them before going down, but it's still annoying. A God of War looked at this and went, ah yes, now here's a faction I can goad into an honor duel. At least the mental image for it is kind of funny. A Gene Stealer somehow infected one, which is even worse than when the Keeper of Secrets did it, because the Avatar of Khaine is not in the slightest bit biological. It's a statue animated by divine energy. You can't infect it. One time it was managing to give some Space Marines, including the Legion of the Damned, some trouble, so they just blasted the dome of the craft world open and jettisoned it out into space. It did manage to put the hurt on the Marines pretty badly, which means that one sounds slightly more impressive on paper at first. At least it does until you realize that it means Space Marines were able to plot armor their way into a position where they were able to comfortably pull off such a maneuver on a damned craft world. They did that instead of what should have happened, that being obliterated by a faction with better technology and psyker powers. In the single scenario possible, they have the numerical advantage over humanity. Maugan Ra killed one to temper his blade, which on the one hand is awesome and metal as hell, but on the other means Khaine is a joke even when he's part of his own faction's lore. The Horus Heresy has 2 really galling moments where an avatar is killed. One is where Lorgar killed a weakened one who had been driven insane by its time in the warp. The weakened part I get. I mean, the Eldar Pantheon at that point no longer exists, so it would have been that shard of Khaine versus every demon in existence ever. The fact it was only weakened was great for him. But the driven insane part? He is a god who fought in the war in heaven. Every demon ever shouldn't have any effect on his mind. But that's nothing compared to Fulgrim, who strangled one to death. Let me just repeat myself, Fulgrim strangled a statue to death. A statue. Imagine strangling Liberty Prime to death, because that's how I view this. I love Games Workshop writing. I love the Horus Heresy. It doesn't do everyone involved in it dirty. It doesn't add needless contrivances to otherwise clean and respectable pieces of lore. Oh, and the half I mentioned earlier is that he got a mutual kill with Scarbrand once. I say half because while yeah, Khaine did die, he also managed to take down Scarbrand, which I guess is impressive. The only modern piece of lore I can think of where Khaine is actually awesome like he should be is Caiaphas Khaine, where he dropped out of the sky like an ODST and murdered a demon princess of Slaanesh. Up to that point, she had completely ignored Jurgen's powers as a blank, a special relic an Inquisitor had which did the same thing as blanks, several Melta-Blasts, and a whole lot of lasgun fire. And of course direct combat with Caiaphas Khaine himself, which is the most dangerous place you can be around Khaine because it means he's about to accident his way to victory over you. Then Khaine with a K rocked up and killed her with rather minimal effort. It might have even perma-killed her too, which is something you can't normally do with demons. Whether or not it did though, it's pretty fitting that Khaine would be the person to help Khaine in a Khaine book. Khaine's gotta stick with Khaine after all. I wonder if they play Vampire the Masquerade together and try and meet Khaine, the first vampire, so Khaine and Khaine can have tabletop adventures with Khaine. I can make this worse, you know, I haven't even mentioned Khaine from Command and Conquer yet. So with that long list of defeats, which just as a heads up, isn't all of them, Khaine has won 2 battles, tied 1, and lost all of the other ones. Oh yeah, he died in a Hammer and Bolter episode 2, during an episode which was ostensibly about the Eldar. He did cut a Dreadnought in half with the toss of his sword and supposedly was fighting non-stop for days prior to that, but that's the funny thing about narratives. What you show on screen is a lot more important than what you tell me happened off screen, and on screen I just saw Khaine getting punked for the 1000th time. Fun fact, the Eldar don't even like the guy. Jane Zar told an Avatar to go to hell once, and overall they consider Khaine to be a last resort not only because you need a sacrifice to get him going, but because he sends them all into a murderous frenzy. They know their myths and of Khaine being the absolute worst, and they don't love the guy much as a result. Moving on to fantasy now, but before I do, another fun fact. The Hrud apparently worship him as a god. He's called Ka or Qua or something, but it's apparently Khaine. Makes sense, I mean the Eldar pantheon was around for 65 million years, surely at least one species would sense him in the warp and start worshipping him. Fantasy now for real. In fantasy, Khaine is largely the same, though he does have a few notable differences. He's the elven god of war and murder, he fought Slaanesh, and he's prayed to with a level of caution by his followers. But after that, we get to the differences, and there's a few of those worth mentioning. For one, the way he's worshipped is vastly different, that being that he's worshipped. In 40k, Khaine is as much a weapon as a god. The Eldar somewhat revere him, but he's also not going to be out and about doing anything without the express consent of the Eldar. Combine that with their general dislike of the guy, and Khaine doesn't get up and about too often. In fantasy, the High Elves fear him. They worship him only as much as needed to keep him from pushing their collective shit in. He's feared by all the Asur because he's a war god and massive asshole, so they give him the minimum amount of praise possible to keep him from setting something important on fire, and that's it. They worship him in the same way the Greeks worshipped Ares. He's part of the pantheon, so you gotta respect him, but no one really likes him since he's a murderous bastard and all that. In times of war, they pray to him for success, but only minimally to avoid being corrupted by his influence. In day-to-day life, they like to pretend he doesn't exist to the extent that they can help it. The Dark Elves, meanwhile, do worship and love him, but that's because he's the god of murder and war. They like murder and war, so they pray to him and he gives them all the good buffs and stuff like that. To the Dark Elves, him and the rest of the evil side of the Elven pantheon supersede Assyrian worship, and they have sacrifices in his honor regularly. Malekith instituted Khaine worship as the Dark Elf chief religion, both because Khaine was happy to give them some help with enough sacrifices, and because too many Dark Elves were worshipping the Chaos Gods otherwise. Like his mother. There's even an event called Death Night, where witch elves go around kidnapping slaves to be sacrificed and elven children to be recruited. Dark elf girls get turned into more witch elves, dark elf boys get thrown into a cauldron of boiling blood. If they live, they're trained as assassins. If you're curious on how often the child survives this process, just toss a baby into boiling water and see what happens. As a disclaimer, this video as well as myself do not condone throwing babies into boiling water in any circumstances. Not unless you yourself are a Druchii witch elf, in which case you keep doing you. Not like I could stop you anyways. The wood elves definitely acknowledge that he exists, and because they're the wood elves, that's all I can say for certainty about the matter. Some probably love the guy, some probably hate him, most of them probably flip their views on him at the drop of a hat. He's not Kurnos or Isha, therefore he isn't the most important to them. During times of war they give him more reverence, but at the end of the day he's always going to be less important than the nature gods. He's also revered by a small but not insubstantial amount of humans, who focus more on his aspect as a god of murder than war. You can probably guess what sort of people like to worship him like that. There was no grand prophecy of him being murdered by the mortal elves, so he never went on a rampage, but that's balanced out by the fact that he's still chained Vol to his anvil, and he loves nothing more than watching elves kill each other. He's got got a nasty habit of leaving his crap lying all over the world, most notably the Sword of Khaine. It's also known as the Widowmaker, which is a great name for a sword if I've ever heard one. If Malekith is the reason for most of the problems in fantasy, the Sword of Khaine is the reason Malekith is such a problem child. The Sword of Khaine corrupts whoever wields it into being a massive shitboot who loves nothing more than war and murder. Since it's a magical god sword, it makes said shitboot really good at war and murder. When demons were invading all of the world at the beginning of the Warhammer world's history, Anarion saved Ulthuan and the elves by picking the damn thing up and using it on the demons. Lore conflicts on whether or not Khaine was cheering him on or telling him not to do it, but since literally every other god, including the Chaos gods, was telling him it wasn't worth it, it's probably a moot point. Even if Khaine was telling him to grab the sword, everyone else saying don't do it probably means he shouldn't have done it. But because Anarion picked up the sword, his entire bloodline is cursed forever, which includes Malekith, his son. In general, he's portrayed as being far more competent of a god than in 40k, although not a better one, strictly speaking. In 40k, he's the Eldar's attack dog, and his followers usually fail because the Eldar aren't allowed to succeed ever. In fantasy, Khaine gave Slaanesh a scar that never heals, no matter what form she takes. Already a massive upgrade compared to 40k, isn't it? Him and his Dark Elf followers are also the reason for 90% of the things wrong with the Warhammer world. Since the Dark Elves revere them, a good portion of the slave raids they go on aren't for slaves, but sacrifices. And if you trace things back far enough, the Dark Elves only formed because Anarion picked up the goddamn Sword of Khaine. Sure, Morathi being evil had nothing to do with Khaine, but without Khaine's influence, Anarion wouldn't have turned into a hot topic shopper, and he probably would have told Morathi to go to hell. And of course, this leads all the way down the rabbit hole because of all the things Malekith and Morathi are responsible for. The War of the Beard, the rise of Nagash and the fall of Nehekara, and countless millions of dead elves are all because of Khaine, an elven god. Mannfred is the reason for the end times, but if you want to stretch it, you can blame Khaine for being the reason the Warhammer fantasy world was in the position to get end times to begin with. All of the constant warring between the elven factions weakening them, necromancy and chaos not getting curb-stomped by what would otherwise be a steadfast alliance of elves and dwarves. It's entirely feasible to blame Khaine for all these travesties, even in a roundabout way. So the question then is why? What does Khaine get out of this whole mess that he would be willing to cause so much destruction, chiefly among the races that he's a god of and worshipped by? Well, that's an easy question to answer, thankfully. He does it for shits and giggles. In fact, he's such an asshole to the elves that human scholars in the setting argue whether or not he's another form of Khorne. Dark elves in particular take offense to this, saying that he's a far more refined killer as opposed to Khorne, who's more or less a divine rabid dog in their eyes. That's also very funny to me, that the Dark Elves of all people think they have the right to be offended at what other people say about them. I'm sure they like to go on long tangents about morality to the slaves they're torturing to death. Another answer as to why he's such a big fan of elves killing each other involves a bit of theory on my part rather than official answers, so for the next 30 seconds or so, keep in mind I'm just spitballing here rather than giving straight lore. You know how Khorne is the god of war, and even if an act of violence isn't strictly in his name, it still empowers him a bit? Well, I imagine Khaine is much the same, but since he's an elven god, he gets the most out of elves specifically doing the killing. Following that logic, when two groups of elves are killing each other, it means he gets an even more potent power boost to himself than he would otherwise. When the high and dark elves go at it, it's the divine version of taking steroids for Khaine. Of course, one could very reasonably make the argument that this is incredibly short-sighted, because if the elves are all killing each other, they'll weaken themselves against outside threats and Khaine will eventually lose all his worshippers. But those two factions have been duking it out for about 10,000 years and they're still going strong. Ignoring the end times, it could be argued that Khaine had a foolproof plan to sustain himself between these two groups fighting each other. Dark elves outright worship him as the head god, and the high elves come knocking when it's time for war. All of those elves killing each other means he gets a heavenly Zenkai boost whenever he wants one. It's completely morally bankrupt, but he's a god of war. Those fellas tend not to care about things like collateral damage. Again though, that was all me giving ideas on why he loves to let the Dark Elves and High Elves kill each other so much, even though they're the people that worship him. As far as official lore goes, I don't think we ever got an explanation beyond him being a colossal dickhead. Of course, as a god, he also wasn't doing too much directly in the setting. He's better off than in 40k because he's treated with the respect a war god deserves, but because he's not just a big unit the higher Dark Elves can field at will, he's not getting around as much. That being said, his influence is still acutely present in those such as Tyrion, Teclis, and Malekith. Ever since Grandpa Anarion drew the Sword of Khaine, his entire bloodline was cursed. Like the Blood Angels, only somehow with even bigger daddy issues. Those three and all of those descended from Anarion before them have the curse of Anarion within them, which as of the end times was revealed to be a small fragment of Khaine within each of them. It played a part in corrupting Malekith to turn him into the evil bastard we all know, it gave Tyrion a hell of a temper, and made both of them pretty damn powerful on the battlefield. And of course, who could forget what it gave Teclis? Magical cholera. I don't even think him being an all-powerful wizard was because he's an Aravanarian. As far as I know, it just gave him a wasting disease. It really sucks to be Teclis. And getting to the end times, Khaine and his ilk get a starring role in the book named after him. I'll be brief so we can stop talking about it faster. As it turned out, Malekith should have been the Phoenix King all those centuries ago when he first threw himself into Asuryan's fire. This is because the end times wasn't happening without shitting all over established lore, so that's what had to be done. Ever since that happened, Asuryan had been testing Malekith, and if he could somehow claim the Phoenix throne, he'd have his blessing finally. Other elven gods were also conspiring to let this happen, as was Teclis. Tyrion saw all of this happening and had a bit of a meltdown. His daughter was dead to bring back Nagash, his country and the world were falling apart, his brother had betrayed him. Things are a mess for him. And just in time to make things even worse, here comes good old Caleb and Chicane to be the devil on Tyrion's shoulder. Call it stupid retcon lore like I did a couple seconds ago, but all of the other elven gods were at least trying to prevent the end times. Khaine, meanwhile, is Khaine. He looked at the efforts of his fellow elven gods, both good and evil, and realized that he had the potential to allow the funniest thing ever to happen. So he whispered in Tyrion's ears louder than any Aravanarian before him and told him that now would be a really good time to draw the Sword of Khaine. With Khaine's influence stronger than ever and Tyrion's life a complete wreck at this point, Tyrion marched straight up to the shrine of the Widowmaker and pulled that bitch out of the stone. And just like that, fantasy now had its own avatar of Khaine. But this isn't a 40k avatar. The avatars in 40k are just shards. It's more accurate to think of them as such rather than anything else, even if the word avatar is probably still correct in what they are. Right now, this was an avatar of Khaine in the sense that Tyrion is the conduit by which all of Khaine's power is being funneled into the mortal world. Functionally, Tyrion was now Khaine. At this point, who's on whose side is a complete mess. Some High Elves remain loyal to the Phoenix Crown and therefore Malekith, whereas others understandably didn't want to bow down to the man who had spent the past several millennia making their existence a living hell. Meanwhile, some Dark Elves remain loyal to Malekith, whereas others made the also reasonable, if evil, choice of joining up with the chief god of their pantheon. The spirits of past Phoenix Kings themselves join up with Malekith to atone for their wrongful coronations, while their skeletons are on Tyrion's side. At least before you knew which side the Ills were on based on how spiky or leafy their armor was, but now it's just a complete shit show. Tyrion kills Orion and therefore the god Kurnos, also kills Malus Darkblade because that guy's life is one long joke and he's the punchline, and overall fights about half of every elven special character to have ever been written. He also gets punted out of Averlorn Team Rocket style by Durthu, which aside from being funny is also a pretty reasonable thing to do. Durthu may not have been able to take the god of war on in a fight, but he's a big tree man. Killing Tyrion, Khaine, and removing him from the premises are two different things, so while he didn't have the firepower, he had the mass to pull it off. All of this culminates in a battle at the Isle of the Dead around the Great Vortex between the two main elven factions. Tyrion, the avatar of Khaine, versus Malekith, the avatar of Asuryan. Even between the various elven characters such as Immerse he'd been fighting and having to face down the avatar of the elven king of the gods, Tyrion still nearly won the final battle against Malekith. But then Alethanar shot him through a weak point in his armor Immerse managed to make and killed him stone dead. Khaine's power vanished, and while everyone had a small heart attack when Malekith picked up the Widowmaker, with Khaine's death it was now just a normal sword. With that, Khaine was now gone from the Warhammer fantasy world, and when Tyrion was revived by Teclis later on, it was free of the god's influence. I should mention though that I skipped over quite the number of horrific things that happened while Tyrion was the avatar of Khaine, like him personally torturing the High Elf Corhill for a day straight before doing an intentionally poor job of having his head cut off. Tyrion can be a dick, and Khaine made him an even bigger one. End times then happen as they do, Warhammer World explodes, we have Age of Sigmar now. Neato. Khaine in Age of Sigmar is dead, but also not. As it turns out, the elven gods are cyclical. They can definitely die, but they can also reincarnate and be born anew if they're worshipped again and enough of their bits are still hanging around somewhere. Unfortunately for Khaine, his body apparently ended up in Khorne's possession and was turned into weapons for his greatest champions, but all was not lost for the K-Man even with this. His heart couldn't be broken down or reforged even by Khorne himself, who only managed to squeeze 8 drops of blood from it. Khorne eventually just gave up and tossed the thing away, which probably obliterated a few dozen cities in the mortal realms on the way out before it eventually came into the possession of Morathi. Morathi wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth and set up the Daughters of Khaine faction, and became the high priestess of it to allow him to be born anew. Except Morathi being Morathi, she lied about that last part. She was instead siphoning the power the worship granted into herself to achieve true godhood. Evidently, she was a bit upset that her son and her husband's grandchildren via another woman all got to be gods, but she didn't. Eventually, this culminated culminated in her entering Slaanesh itself to absorb the power of the Phoenix King still in Slaanesh's gut and achieve true godhood, which she manages to pull off without any major complications for once. It does weaken the bonds of Slaanesh's prison, but Morathi's done something that caused that to happen before, and apparently still cannot see why weakening the prison of the goddess who loves nothing more than to eat elf souls is perhaps a bad thing to do. Morathi ascends to godhood, and Khaine is officially no more. Instead, his essence was transferred into Morathi, who is now known as the goddess Morathi Khaine. Maybe. Theory crafting a bit again, but it's possible Khaine is just going with the flow on this one. For one, Morathi could potentially be a conduit for his rebirth in this way, which would probably save the guy a lot of energy. For two, Morathi is undoubtedly going to get a lot of elves killed like this, and Khaine loves nothing more than getting elves killed. And for three, the elven pantheon is loosely based on the ancient Greek pantheon. With all the weird shit the Greek gods turned into in myth, Khaine deciding he wants to be a snake lady for a bit is hardly the most out there thing in the world. So there's the lore of the bloody-handed god, but how about do or don't Khaine? This'll just be for 40k, since the Daughters of Khaine are their own faction and deserve their own video. For lore positives, if you want a straight-up god on your side, then there's only one other option for you here, and that's the Incarn. Aside from further proof of Eldar's superiority that half of the remaining Pantheon throws down directly on the battlefield, it's also quite the narrative event you can make out of it. No other faction can summon the gods themselves onto the battlefield, so if that's the sort of havoc you want to achieve, then you can't do better than summoning the actual god of war onto the battlefield. Necrons don't count, the Catan are false gods. If you're of the mind that the lesser races of the galaxy need to learn their place, then there's also no better way to do that than to field Khaine. By that I of course mean if you want your tabletop army to be incredibly dedicated to violence. Khaine's influence drives the Eldar into a murder frenzy and overrides all the protections they normally put into place to shield their minds from the horrors of war. An army fielding Khaine is an army bent on raising everything in front of them to the ground, so if that's the kind of Eldar player you are, then go for them. And of course, if you want to be fighting in the most titanic of battles, that's the sort of thing an army with Khaine in it is perfect for. The Eldar prepare for the greatest battle in thousands of years, summoning the war god to lead their host to ultimate victory against millions of their foes. Of course, that being said, narratively he's not out of place against smaller but still major threats. The Kaivis Khaine battle he took place in featured an all-out war on both the ground and in space between the Eldar, Imperium, and eventually Chaos. Khaine himself, however, only fought against a single demon princess of Slaanesh. While best for large-scale conflicts, Khaine's happy to focus his attention on murdering small groups of people if need be. And the lore positives for Khaine end there. He's a god of war after all, he's not a subtle or nuanced character, he wants to hit things with his pointy stick. Let's move on to tabletop pros. Unsurprisingly, Khaine is an absolute monster on the tabletop. He's got 14 wounds, a 4-up invulnerable save, and a 2-up regular save, and on top of that, he halves all damage taken. He's not going down to anything but either the hardest hitting weapons or concentrated firepower from half the army. He's far from only being tanky though. Anything that comes into contact with him is going to die a messy death. Let's start with the least impressive thing in his arsenal, his shooting attack. Only one attack and only with a range of 12 inches, but it hits on a 2-up at strength 16 with AP -4 and causes d6 plus 2 wounds. It also has sustained hits d3, meaning if you roll a 6 on your to hit roll, it actually hits anywhere from 2 to 4 times. Naturally though, he shines in melee combat. Khaine has 2 profiles he can use with his weapon, the Wailing Doom, Strike or Sweep. With Strike, he hits at Strength 14, AP -4, and causes d6 plus 2 mortal wounds across 6 attacks. With Sweep, he hits at Strength 7, AP -2, and causes 2 wounds flat across 12 attacks. All of these hit on 2+, by the way, so which option you take entirely depends on whether or not you're facing a horde of weaker enemies or small groups of stronger ones. To be clear, with Strike he can put out a maximum of 54 wounds in a single turn, although that does assume both that all of his hits connect and he rolls a 6 on every dice rolled. And it should also be noted that a Warhound Scout Titan only has 40 wounds. If you get lucky, you can make sure that your opponent who brought his fancy Forge World mortgage payment to the table never wants to play with you ever again, because while it's unlikely, it's not that unlikely that Khaine can one-shot the thing. Its invulnerable save only applies to ranged attacks, which means Khaine can rip that thing apart with ease as long as he gets into melee range. AP -4, remember, that's no joke. And lastly, his model is goddamn beautiful. You can give him all different sorts of options for his head as well as his weapon, and it's just overall a nice thing to look at. A bit of a pain to paint, as I can confirm for you because that's what I'm painting right now, but hey, nothing's perfect and I've painted worse, so it's not that bad. Khaine's got his downsides though, so let's just rip the band-aid off quickly. For the lore negatives, he's an asshole. I hope I've made that abundantly clear throughout this video, but in case I haven't, here it is again. Khaine is the absolute worst. What really sets him apart from other evil gods like the Ruinous Powers is that he's not affiliated with Chaos or anything like that, he's just a prick because that's what he's like. The best case you can imagine for an army playing him is that the Eldar have summoned him as a last-ditch effort to prevent defeat. At At worst, you willingly brought forth one of the most malicious gods in the setting into the universe and set him loose. So your options for fielding Khaine narratively boil down to either complete desperation or willingly choosing to be the worst ever. And of course it goes without saying that narratively Khaine is a joke in 40k. You are fielding a character who has a win-loss ratio deeply in the negatives, and your opponent may damn well make fun of you for this. You can wipe his smug grin off his face if you want, but unfortunately no amount of tabletop wins will give Khaine an official one. As for tabletop negatives, he's really only got the fact that he's a blunder going for him. A very good blunder, but that's it. He does let units within 6 inches of him add 1 to run and charge rolls, which is nice, but not exactly blowing anyone away. And given that he wants to rush into melee, it only really helps you if you have a blob of howling banshees around him. Other than that, doesn't help his army out in the slightest. He's a selfish war god, expecting his followers to rush in with him rather than giving them any actual support or buffs. He's also not the quickest lad at 10 inches of movement. Now 10 inches is by no means slow, but it's not great for him given his abilities and size. If he isn't in melee, he's not going to be doing all that much aside from sniping individual models, and because he's so goddamn big, everyone is going to target him. He's going to be lumbering up the battlefield for at least a turn before he can really start going to town on the enemy, and with only 10 inches of movement, it's not out of the realm of possibility for his target to kite him around the map if you get tunnel vision. And of course, his point cost, which right now I believe is going to run you 295 points to field Khaine. Not the most expensive character around, but definitely pricey. You can fit him in at smaller games, but that'll severely limit how many troops he can field otherwise, and if he dies, you should probably just forfeit. In larger games, as long as he makes his point back, losing him probably won't kill you, but if he dies early on, you're still gonna feel it. Overall, Khaine needs to be used with some level of finesse. He's a blender and that's all he is, and it's not like you need a truly great strategic plan to utilize him, but more so general game sense. Don't chase him after units quicker than him, and figure out the best route to put him in the place where he can cause the most damage, and Khaine will do you just fine. And that's Khaine. Hopefully I've made you appreciate him a bit more, since he's a lot cooler than people consider him to be. GW included, it feels like sometimes. And thank you to WarThunder for sponsoring this video. Nowhere else can you take a 1920s biplane and ram it into a top-of-the-line World War II naval ship. Remember both to use my link in the description or pinned comment for a wide variety of premium vehicles, currency, and more, and that the game is quite literally free. Download WarThunder today, and get ready to send everyone in your crosshairs directly to the afterlife. And of course, thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Widowmaker to my Khaine, letting me bring destruction and anguish to the mortal world. If you would like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Here's hoping Khaine gets some godly friends in 40k tabletop soon. The Incarn is a good start, but more is always welcome. They don't even need to be full gods or avatars like Khaine is. Imagine little demons of Isha running around, or the same but for Kegarak. That'd be cool.